"Sir, can I slip under your coat?" the young girl whispered. The silent rancher froze in shock. The wind howled across the frozen plains, carrying with it flakes of ice that stung any exposed skin. The horizon was a blur of white and gray, endless snow dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. In this harsh world, only the strongest or the cleverest survived. Callan, a lone rancher, had learned both lessons. He moved steadily, boots crunching on the hardened ice, his long coat wrapped tight around his body, a hood shielding his face from the biting wind. Around him, the creatures he tended shifted in the cold, their thick fur bristling against the storm. They were not ordinary animals. They were bioengineered for the planet, hardy, intelligent, and loyal. Callan had raised them from birth, and they were more than livestock. They were companions, guardians, and sometimes friends. Callan was a man of few words. The isolation of his life had made him quiet, not from shyness, but from habit. Years of listening to the wind, to the creatures, to the silent world around him, had taught him that noise could be dangerous. There was a rhythm to survival here, and speaking unnecessarily could disturb it. Today, the storm was worse than usual. The sky, a thick gray canvas, pressed down on the land, and the cold gnawed at the edges of his gloves and face. He adjusted the pack on his back, feeling the familiar weight of tools, rations, and a few precious supplies. It was dangerous to linger, and yet he had a route to check, a herd to guide, and a small cabin that awaited him, its fire promising warmth and safety. As he trudged through the snow, something small and unnatural caught his eye, a movement that did not belong to the creatures he knew, a shadow among the white. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, the wind whipping against his face. At first he thought it might be an animal, perhaps lost from the herd, but the shape shifted, moved upright in a way no creature could. Callan paused, hand hovering near the strap of the rifle he carried. Even the hardest human-made gear would offer little protection against the storm if he made a mistake. The figure emerged more clearly, and Callan froze. It was a girl, small, no more than 10 years old, her clothes thin against the frozen landscape. Her hair, dark and damp, clung to her face, and her eyes were wide with fear and cold. She stumbled forward, dragging one booted foot behind her, snow crunching sharply beneath her steps. She did not scream, did not call for help. She simply moved, silent as the ice itself. When she finally reached him, her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Sir, can I slip under your coat?" Callan's heart skipped a beat. He was a quiet man, not easily surprised, but this was unexpected. He looked down at her, assessing the risk, the danger, and the impossibility of what she asked. Yet in her eyes he saw no trick, no threat, only desperation. The kind that gnaws at a person when the cold bites deeper than flesh and when life seems to hang by a thread. He could feel it in the tense line of her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched at the frayed ends of her coat. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle her, and studied her face. She was pale, almost ghostly in the storm, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that made him pause. Not fear, not panic, something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or determination. The kind of spark that humans, against all odds, seem to carry even in the most impossible conditions. You can't survive out here alone," Callan said finally, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. The words were strange in his own ears. He was not used to speaking to others, certainly not to strangers, certainly not to a child who had appeared as if from nowhere. I have to," she whispered, shivering. They're after me." Callan stiffened. He knew of rumors, scattered whispers about humans disappearing, taken by alien patrols or experiments. He had not believed all of it. People had a way of exaggerating, especially when fear was involved. But the desperation in her voice, the reality of her presence in this storm, made him reconsider. Somehow, she had survived the impossible journey to reach him, and that alone spoke of a will he respected. Humans, he knew, had a resilience that could outmatch technology, strength, and even luck. Without another word, he opened his coat wider, allowing her to slip beneath it. The warmth of his body and the heavy layers of his clothing enveloped her instantly, and she pressed close, shivering violently. Callan felt a pang of responsibility, a strange weight settling onto his shoulders. He had chosen a life of isolation, far from the chaos of the wider galaxy, but now fate had intruded, and it demanded action. The girl's body trembled against him, but she did not speak. Perhaps she was too exhausted, or perhaps the silence was all she could manage in a world that had shown her so little mercy. Callan adjusted his coat, making sure she was secure, and then hoisted her slightly so she could walk with him. Her tiny steps matched his, and together they moved through the storm, a fragile pair against the fury of the frozen plains. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless under the gray sky. The wind tore at them, ice stung their faces, and the snow threatened to swallow their tracks. Callan kept his senses alert. Every sound, every shadow mattered. In this land, a mistake could mean death, and the presence of the girl added a new layer of danger he could not ignore. Finally, in the distance, a faint glow appeared, the telltale sign of his cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin thread against the gray. Callan felt a small surge of relief. Shelter was close, warmth awaited, and for the first time in many years he had someone depending on him. Inside, the cabin was modest but safe. The fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the creatures he had raised watched silently, curious but obedient. Callan set the girl down gently, and she sank to the floor, exhausted. He handed her a blanket, wrapping it around her small shoulders, and she huddled close to it, still shivering. "You're safe," he said softly, though he was not sure she heard. She was too tired, her body too weak from the journey and the cold. Callan looked around the cabin, taking stock. Supplies were limited, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. If the aliens were truly after her, they could be tracking her even now. He would have to be careful, clever. Humans were never naturally the strongest in the galaxy, but they had a talent for survival, for using their wits against impossible odds. He would need every bit of that talent in the coming days. As the girl drifted into a restless sleep, Callan studied her. She was small, fragile, but there was a light in her eyes, even closed, that spoke of courage. She had made it this far, through the storm, through fear, through the unknown. And that light, that spark, reminded him of why humans endured, why they were different. They were adaptable, unpredictable, and when necessary, brilliant in ways no other species could predict. He did not know her story, the full weight of what she had endured, or what she represented. But one thing was certain, she had arrived at his doorstep, and in doing so she had changed his life. The storm continued to rage outside, relentless and merciless, but inside the cabin there was warmth, shelter, and a fragile sense of hope. Callan sat in silence, listening to the crackling fire and the occasional movement of the creatures nearby. He thought of the path ahead, of the dangers they would face, and of the resilience of the human spirit that had brought her here. Somewhere out there, threats lurked, alien forces that believed humans were weak and expendable. They had not yet learned that humans had a way of surviving when survival seemed impossible, of turning weakness into strength, and of finding hope in the coldest, darkest places. The wind howled against the walls, the snow continued to fall, and the girl slept, unaware that she had ignited something in the silent rancher. Something that had lain dormant for years. A sense of purpose, of responsibility, and perhaps a glimmer of connection. Callan watched her for a long time, and then quietly he whispered to himself, "We will survive this." Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the fire burned, and for the first time in a long while, the cabin was not empty. A small, shivering human had arrived, and with her, a challenge, and perhaps a promise, of what it meant to be human. The storm outside had not yet lessened when Callan finally moved closer to the fire. He could hear the girl's shallow breathing, see the way her small chest rose and fell beneath the blanket. Her hair, damp from the snow, clung to her face and her lips were pale. The fire offered warmth, but it could not chase away the fear that lingered in her eyes. Callan knew it would take more than heat to restore her. It would take trust, and trust was earned slowly in small pieces. He sat across from her on a rough wooden chair, the creatures in the room watching silently. Their eyes, bright and intelligent, seemed almost to understand the tension. They knew something was different this time. Something important had arrived, something that required attention, vigilance, and care. Callan ran a hand over his beard and considered what to do next. He had survived alone for years, and his life had been simple in its own quiet way. Now it had become complicated. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Not because he feared she would run away, she could barely move, but because he needed her to start talking, to tell him why she had come. The girl stirred, blinking slowly, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She seemed hesitant, unsure whether to answer, but the need to speak overcame her. "My name is Lyra," she whispered. Her voice was quiet, almost broken, but it carried something beyond fear. There was a determination in her tone that Callan recognized, the same stubbornness he had seen in countless humans surviving the harshest conditions. Lyra, he repeated, letting the name linger. It felt foreign in the quiet of the cabin, but also real. Names mattered. They gave people existence, and in this lonely, frozen world, existence was a treasure. Where did you come from? She paused, glancing at the fire, then at him. I was taken. The words were hesitant, fragmented, but enough to send a shiver down Callan's spine. Taken. By whom and from where? The patrols, she continued, her small hands trembling as she moved the blanket aside. The aliens, they hunt humans. They want us for experiments. My home is gone, my family. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the blanket. Callan felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had heard rumors of humans disappearing, whispers of alien forces that treated humans as weak, expendable, or even dangerous. But this was real, and it was here in his cabin, beneath his coat, in the fragile form of a shivering child. He had no illusions about what humans could do in direct combat against advanced alien species. They lacked the physical strength, the natural defenses. But humans had something aliens often underestimated: intelligence, unpredictability, and the stubborn will to survive. Safe here, he said softly, almost as if speaking aloud would make it true. They won't find you inside. Lyra lifted her head slightly, her wide eyes meeting his. She looked skeptical, yet there was a flicker of hope in her gaze. You'll help me, she asked. The question was so small, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of her entire journey, the terror she had faced alone across frozen plains. Callan did not answer immediately. He studied her, the firelight casting shadows across her small face. There were dangers ahead. If the aliens detected her or even tracked her signal, there would be no warning, no mercy. But he had made a choice the moment she slipped under his coat. Protecting her was not just an act of kindness. It was a decision that might define the coming days. I will, he said finally. The words felt heavier than the coat that still held her close. But you must listen, understand. Lyra nodded, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. She seemed to understand the seriousness of his tone. Callan could see that, beneath her fragility, she carried a spark that humans often carried even when the world was against them. For hours, they remained near the fire. Lyra told him little at first, mostly fragmented words, images of shadows, sounds, patrols that had taken her from her home. Callan listened, offering only occasional murmurs, guiding her with quiet patience. He learned that she had been on the run for days, surviving in temperatures that would have frozen even the hardiest animals. Humans were not meant for such extremes, and yet she had endured. That resilience, that sheer determination to keep going despite fear and exhaustion, was the hallmark of their species. Night deepened, and the storm outside intensified. The wind lashed against the cabin walls, snow piling against the door in heavy drifts. Lyra shivered again, and Callan moved closer, adjusting the blanket around her. He felt the fragility of her small body, and yet he could sense the strength hidden within it. Humans often seemed weak to others, he thought, but that weakness was misleading. It was a mask, a test, a way to survive where stronger creatures might fail. You need to rest, he said softly. Tomorrow we plan, we move carefully. The patrols, they may be looking. Lyra nodded, closing her eyes. Sleep took her slowly, the warmth of the fire and the safety of the cabin lulling her into exhaustion. Callan stayed awake, staring into the flames. He thought about what she had said, about the aliens, about the humans they hunted. It made sense now, the rumors, the whispers, the missing colonies. Humans were everywhere underestimated. They were adaptable, clever, and resilient. They could endure what others could not, and yet they were often treated as insignificant. He thought about his life before the storm, before Lyra arrived. Years of quiet solitude, tending creatures and surviving on the edges of the frozen world. He had chosen isolation, believing it safer than the chaos of human settlements. Yet in this moment, he realized that humans were never truly alone. They carried within them the ability to connect, to care, and to survive together even against impossible odds. Morning came slowly. The storm had softened, though the wind still carried shards of ice that cut through any exposed skin. Callan roused Lyra gently, helping her sit and sip from a flask of warm water. Her eyes, tired but alert, met his, and he could see the determination still burning within her. She had endured the storm, the cold, and the fear. She was small, fragile, and yet in her presence he felt the pulse of human courage. "We need to move," he said. "The storm may have slowed them, but it won't stop them for long. We leave before they find us." Lyra nodded, gathering what little belongings she had managed to carry. Callan secured the cabin, checking traps and reinforcing weak points. His creatures followed silently, their instincts sharp, their eyes scanning the frozen horizon. They were not just animals, they were part of the defense, part of the survival plan that humans so often relied on. They were loyal, intelligent, and adaptive, just like their caretaker. As they stepped into the snow, Callan felt the familiar sting of wind on his face. Lyra clung to his side, her small body shielded beneath his coat. He guided her carefully across the frozen plains, avoiding ice fissures and unstable snowdrifts. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. Humans were not naturally the fastest or the strongest, but they had endurance, cunning, and an ability to learn from the world around them. Hours passed. The landscape stretched endlessly, white and gray, with only the occasional shadow of distant peaks to mark their progress. Lyra spoke little, conserving energy, but every now and then she would glance up at him, her eyes questioning, trusting, and hopeful. Callan answered with gestures, simple nods, guiding her through the frozen wilderness with careful precision. They reached a narrow canyon, walls of ice rising sharply on either side. Callan stopped, sensing the danger immediately. The patrols could use this terrain to their advantage, but humans, he thought, could also use it. They were clever, capable of thinking in ways the aliens might not predict. He scanned the horizon, the edges of the canyon, the sky above. Every shadow mattered, every sound could be a warning. "Stay close," he whispered, "and don't make a sound." Lyra obeyed instinctively, stepping carefully, her small boots leaving faint prints in the snow. Callan led her through the canyon, watching the walls for movement. Hours seemed to pass in tense silence, and he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. She had come this far, survived impossible conditions, and now it was his turn to protect her. At the end of the canyon, the landscape opened again into a plateau, wind less harsh, snow more manageable. Callan allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had made it this far, and the patrols had not yet found them. But he knew this was only the beginning. Lyra had a story, a past, and a danger that followed her across frozen worlds. And humans, he thought, had a way of surviving not by brute strength, but by cleverness, patience, and the determination to endure what others could not. They moved forward cautiously, leaving the canyon behind, stepping into a world still vast, still dangerous, but alive with possibility. And in that moment, Callan knew one thing with certainty. Humans, even small and fragile, were never truly weak. The plateau stretched endlessly before them, pale and empty under the weak light of the frozen sun. The snow crunched beneath Callan's boots as he led Lyra carefully across the icy ground. Her small hands clutched the edges of his coat, and every now and then she stumbled, but he was always there to steady her. The wind had lessened, yet the cold still bit through their layers, a constant reminder that survival was never easy. They moved slowly, deliberately. Callan had taught himself to read the land over years of living in isolation. He knew the signs of thin ice, hidden crevices, and sudden snow drifts. He guided Lyra with quiet precision, pointing out subtle changes in the terrain, teaching her to step carefully, to notice the cracks that could betray danger and the shadows where predators might hide. She listened, absorbing every word, her eyes bright with focus and determination. Even in her fragile state, she had a keen mind, one that learned quickly, as humans often did. As they walked, Callan scanned the horizon constantly. The patrols could be anywhere. Their alien trackers were relentless, and once they picked up a human trail, they did not relent. He had faced small patrols before, encountering them only briefly while scouting the land. They were strong, precise, and almost emotionless, relying on numbers and brute force rather than adaptability. Humans, however, thrived on unpredictability, improvisation, and quick thinking. It was an advantage Callan had relied on many times, and now it would be needed again. Hours passed, and the plateau gave way to a narrow valley, flanked by jagged rock formations that cut through the snow. Callan slowed, his senses alert. The valley was a natural trap for anyone who did not know it well. He stopped and knelt, examining the snow. Small prints, irregular and slightly smeared, suggested someone or something had passed recently. Alien patrols, they were close. "Quiet," he whispered to Lyra, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "They've been here, we move carefully now." She nodded, her small lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes, wide with fear, did not waver from him. Callan admired that. Humans often showed courage in the quietest moments when no one else was watching. Even a child, alone in a frozen wilderness, could be brave enough to endure what many adults could not. They moved forward, slipping through the valley with careful steps. Callan kept Lyra close, guiding her behind rocks and snow drifts, teaching her to use the environment to hide, to blend in. She absorbed the lessons quickly, crouching behind a rock when he gestured, staying perfectly still as shadows moved around them. Suddenly, a faint hum reached their ears, a sound that did not belong to the wind. Callan froze. The aliens used scanning devices that could detect heat, movement, or even subtle changes in the atmosphere. He crouched lower, signaling Lyra to do the same. Through a small gap between the rocks, he spotted a patrol moving across the valley. 3 of them tall and angular, their silicone-like skin reflecting the dim light. Their eyes glowed faintly, scanning, searching. Callan studied their movements carefully. There was a rhythm to their patrol, predictable if one watched closely. He whispered instructions to Lyra, showing her how to move silently behind rocks, how to let shadows cover them, how to breathe without revealing themselves. She followed perfectly, her small body moving with surprising grace. Even in the face of danger, humans could learn quickly and adapt in ways other species did not expect. The patrol moved closer, their sensors humming softly, scanning the snow and the rocks. Callan's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm. Panic would be fatal. Humans were not the fastest, but they were clever, patient, and able to use the environment to their advantage. He had survived many close encounters by relying on these traits. Now he was teaching Lyra the same lessons. The aliens paused near a snow drift, their heads tilting as if sensing something. Callan and Lyra froze. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of humans. One of the patrols moved closer, its glowing eyes scanning the area where they were hidden. Callan pressed Lyra closer, whispering, "Hold still. Don't move until I tell you." Seconds stretched into minutes. The patrol's head tilted again, then turned, moving past them. Callan exhaled slowly, feeling the tension release. Lyra mirrored him, her small body relaxing slightly, though her eyes remained alert. She had survived this encounter, learned from it, and endured. That was the essence of humans, resilience in the face of danger and the ability to adapt quickly when the odds seemed impossible. They continued through the valley, the patrols now behind them. Callan allowed himself a brief moment of hope. Perhaps they had evaded detection. Perhaps the storm had masked their trail, but he knew this was only temporary. The aliens would not give up easily, and humans had to be ready for anything. As they moved, Callan pointed out subtle signs of life. Tracks of small creatures that could provide food, patches of ice that hid fresh water, areas where the snow was soft enough to dig for shelter. He taught Lyra how to read the land, to notice patterns, and to anticipate danger. Even in her exhaustion, she absorbed every lesson, asking questions, observing carefully. Her mind was sharp, and her determination was strong. Humans, when pushed to extremes, often discovered strengths they did not know they had. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley. Callan found a small overhang, a natural shelter formed by rocks and ice. It was not much, but it would protect them from the cold and provide a place to rest. He helped Lyra inside, spreading a blanket and sharing some of his rations. She ate slowly, conserving energy, and he watched her, noting the small signs of fatigue and determination that made humans remarkable. Night fell, and the cold deepened. Callan built a small fire using carefully gathered wood and scraps, its flames flickering against the rocks. Lyra huddled close, absorbing the warmth, her eyes reflecting the light of the fire. They remained silent, listening to the sounds of the valley, the wind, the distant hum of patrols, the faint movement of creatures. Every sound was a signal, every shadow a possible threat. Humans had to be vigilant, and even the smallest mistake could be deadly. Callan reflected on the journey so far. Lyra had survived incredible odds, crossing frozen plains alone, evading patrols, and trusting him enough to slip under his coat. That trust, fragile as it was, gave him hope. Humans were never truly weak. Their minds, their adaptability, and their courage allowed them to endure what others could not. Even a child could survive when guided, protected, and inspired to use her wits. The night passed slowly. Callan remained awake for much of it, watching the valley and ensuring they remained hidden. Lyra slept, exhausted but safe, and he felt a sense of responsibility that pressed heavily on his shoulders. The patrols would not give up, and the journey ahead would be dangerous. But he was not afraid. Humans had a way of surviving against impossible odds, and he trusted that they could endure whatever lay ahead. Morning arrived quietly, the first light reflecting off the ice and snow. Callan roused Lyra gently, and they prepared to move again. The valley was treacherous, and every step required caution. He checked his supplies, ensuring they had enough food, water, and tools for the journey. Lyra helped, carrying small items and learning how to ration supplies, how to move efficiently, and how to remain alert in the presence of danger. They continued through the valley, moving with careful precision. Callan taught her how to listen for the patrols, how to read the patterns of the wind, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. She learned quickly, her small mind absorbing every lesson, and he marveled at her resilience. Humans, he thought, were extraordinary. They could endure, adapt, and survive in ways that even the most advanced species could not predict. As they approached the edge of the valley, Callan paused. In the distance, he saw movement, more patrols, their forms tall and angular against the pale landscape. He signaled for Lyra to crouch, pressing her close as he scanned their approach. The patrols were systematic, scanning the area for any sign of life. They did not seem to notice the small pair hiding among the rocks, but Callan knew they would soon. He whispered instructions to Lyra, showing her how to remain hidden, how to breathe quietly, and how to move only when necessary. She nodded, her small hands gripping his coat, her eyes focused and alert. Humans had an uncanny ability to survive when guided and when they trusted each other. This was why they endured, why they persisted, why they could never truly be counted out. The patrols moved past, their glowing eyes scanning the snow, but they did not see them. Callan exhaled slowly, feeling the tension release. Lyra mirrored him, her body relaxing slightly as they waited for the patrols to disappear completely. Once the danger had passed, they continued toward the distant hills, moving cautiously but with renewed determination. The journey was far from over, and the patrols would not give up easily. But Callan knew that humans had a way of surviving against impossible odds. They could endure, adapt, and overcome, even when the world seemed against them. Lyra walked beside him, small and fragile but determined, and he felt a sense of hope. Humans were never truly weak. Their minds, their courage, and their resilience allowed them to survive where others would fail. And together, they would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. The hills ahead rose gradually from the pale expanse of the frozen plains. Their jagged peaks caught the morning light, glinting faintly against the white landscape. Callan moved carefully, scanning the terrain, noting every ridge and crevice. Lyra kept close, her small hand gripping his coat, her eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. The patrols had not yet appeared, but he knew better than to trust their absence. Aliens were relentless. They tracked humans across worlds with a persistence that could be terrifying, but humans had their own ways of surviving. Ingenuity, courage, and determination often outweighed brute strength. Hours passed as they ascended the first ridge. The wind was harsh, cutting through layers of clothing, but the sun offered warmth to balance it. Callan paused briefly to let Lyra catch her breath, handing her a small ration of food. She ate quickly, her hunger evident, but careful not to waste the tiny supply. Her small face was smudged with ice and soot from the fire, yet there was a fierce determination in her eyes. She was human, and humans endured. That simple truth had carried their species across countless worlds and unimaginable hardships. The hills stretched further than Callan had anticipated. The path was steep, treacherous, and full of hidden dangers. Thin ice patches glimmered beneath the snow, and loose stones threatened every step. He led Lyra with caution, showing her where to place her feet, how to balance on slippery rocks, and how to notice subtle changes in the terrain that could signal danger. She absorbed the lessons quickly, her mind sharp, her attention focused. Even at her age, she understood that survival depended on observation, careful movement, and trust in those guiding her. By midday, they reached a plateau that overlooked a narrow valley. Callan stopped, scanning the area carefully. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, thin, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest life. He gestured to Lyra to remain silent and crouched behind a rock, examining the horizon. In the valley below, structures emerged from the snow, metallic, angular, and partially buried by the ice. It was a settlement, hidden, isolated, and fortified. Humans. Lyra's eyes widened as she followed his gaze. A home, she whispered, her voice trembling. Callan nodded slowly. A safe place, for humans like you. The thought of sanctuary brought a flicker of hope to both of them. They had survived storms, patrols, and the harshness of the frozen plains, and now they stood at the edge of a hidden refuge. But Callan knew that safety was never guaranteed. Alien patrols were unpredictable, and even the cleverest humans could be caught unprepared. They had to move carefully, plan their descent, and reach the sanctuary without drawing attention. The journey down the ridge was slower than the climb. Callan led Lyra along hidden paths, avoiding open spaces where movement could be detected from a distance. Every rock, every snowdrift, every shadow became a tool for concealment. Lyra moved quietly, her small body adapting to the careful rhythm he set. Humans were not naturally the strongest creatures, but their ability to learn quickly, to adjust to danger, and to make decisions under pressure was unmatched. Lyra's resilience shone through every step she took. As they approached the valley floor, Callan motioned for Lyra to pause. The structures were closer now, and movement within them suggested that they were not abandoned. He observed patterns, humans moving between buildings, tending small equipment and maintaining defenses. This was more than a settlement. It was a sanctuary, a place built to survive against alien threats. Callan glanced down at Lyra. Her face was pale but determined, and her eyes shone with a mix of fear and anticipation. She had come so far, endured so much, and now she was moments from safety. Yet he knew better than to assume the journey was over. The patrols could still detect them, and even the sanctuary itself might not be ready for new arrivals. Humans had to be cautious, even among their own kind. He led her along a hidden path, using the natural contours of the valley to remain unseen. The closer they got, the more he could observe the structures. Solar collectors gleamed in the sun, partially buried in snow, providing power to the settlement. Small tunnels and hidden entrances suggested careful planning. Humans had survived in these frozen worlds not by brute force but by ingenuity, by creating systems that allowed them to endure and adapt. Finally, they reached the outer perimeter. A figure emerged from behind a building, a human older with weathered features and sharp eyes. He raised a hand in cautious greeting. Callan signaled Lyra to remain behind him. The man approached slowly, assessing the newcomers. "You've brought someone," the man said, his voice low but steady. "A child? Who is she?" "This is Lyra," Callan replied. "She's alone." "The patrols have been after her." The man's eyes narrowed. "They've been hunting humans again." His voice carried both concern and determination. "Come inside, quickly. We'll explain everything once you're safe." Callan led Lyra through a concealed entrance, descending into a tunnel that led to the heart of the sanctuary. Inside, warmth enveloped them, a stark contrast to the frozen landscape outside. Humans moved about efficiently, maintaining equipment, preparing food, and ensuring the safety of their home. Lyra's eyes widened as she looked around. She had never seen so many humans in one place, all alive, all safe, and all working together. The older man, who introduced himself as Raven, led them to a small room near the center of the sanctuary. Lyra was offered water and food, which she consumed eagerly. Callan stood back, allowing her to settle, while he and Raven discussed the broader situation. "The patrols have been tracking humans across this planet," Raven explained. "They believe we're weak, easy to capture, easy to experiment on, but they're wrong. Humans have survived because we are adaptable, clever, and resourceful. We find ways to endure, to fight back, to outsmart those who think they can control us." Callan listened carefully, noting the strategic plans Raven outlined. The sanctuary was more than a refuge. It was a hub for resistance. Humans had built systems to hide from alien sensors, traps to defend against patrols, and networks to communicate across frozen landscapes. Every structure, every device, every rule was designed to ensure survival. Lyra, listening quietly, began to understand the magnitude of her situation. She was not just a survivor. She was part of something larger. Humans had been underestimated for generations, hunted and dismissed, yet they endured, survived, and adapted. Her courage and determination had carried her across impossible odds, and now she was at the center of a community that embodied the very essence of human resilience. Callan observed her, pride and concern mixing in his chest. She had survived storms, alien patrols, and exhaustion, and now she faced the challenge of understanding a larger human struggle. But he knew that humans, even children, could rise to meet challenges that seemed impossible. They had an uncanny ability to adapt, to think creatively, and to endure against all odds. Raven led them further into the sanctuary, showing them areas where humans trained, repaired equipment, and shared knowledge. Lyra's eyes widened at the ingenuity around her. Simple but effective technologies adapted to the harsh environment, systems that maximized efficiency, and strategies designed to outsmart stronger, faster enemies. Humans were clever in ways aliens could not anticipate, and that cleverness had allowed them to survive against overwhelming odds. As the day progressed, Lyra met other children who had also survived patrols, as well as adults who had endured years in the frozen wilderness. Each one carried stories of resilience, courage, and cleverness. They shared knowledge, tactics, and techniques that allowed them to thrive despite constant danger. Lyra began to understand that her journey had been just one part of a much larger story, a story of humans surviving in the face of relentless threats, using intelligence, creativity, and the unyielding desire to endure. Callan and Raven discussed strategies to protect the sanctuary, considering patrol movements, environmental advantages, and human ingenuity. Plans were drawn, systems inspected, and traps prepared. Humans had survived by thinking ahead, predicting patterns, and improvising when situations changed unexpectedly. That adaptability was their greatest strength, and it was the reason they could stand against forces that might have destroyed less resourceful species. Night fell and the sanctuary settled into a quiet rhythm. Fires burned, systems hummed, and humans moved about cautiously, aware that danger could appear at any moment. Lyra rested, her mind filled with the new knowledge of human resilience and survival. She had traveled alone, faced patrols, and endured hardships that would have defeated most, yet she had arrived at a place where humans thrived together, using cleverness, courage, and cooperation to survive. Callan stood near the entrance, watching over the perimeter. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but also a sense of hope. Humans were never truly weak. Their minds, courage, and adaptability allowed them to endure where others would fail. Lyra's survival, the sanctuary, and the continued existence of humans on this frozen world were proof of that. As he looked out over the snowy plains beyond the sanctuary walls, he realized that humans had a future, even in a world that seemed hostile and unforgiving. They would survive, adapt, and thrive. Lyra had arrived alone, but she would not remain so. Humans were clever, resilient, and united by the drive to endure. And together they could face anything, even the relentless patrols that sought to extinguish them. The sun had barely risen when alarms echoed through the hidden sanctuary. Callan was already awake, standing near the entrance, eyes scanning the frozen plains. He had suspected it would come. Alien patrols were persistent, and their tracking technology was sophisticated. Yet humans had survived far worse than numbers and machines. They endured through wit, creativity, and courage. Lyra, now more confident and alert, stood beside him. She had slept little, filled with a restless energy born of anticipation and responsibility. She had learned much in the sanctuary, how to move silently, how to read the terrain, and how humans had adapted to survive the relentless pursuit of aliens. Today, she would put that knowledge to the test. Raven appeared, moving swiftly and deliberately, carrying instructions. "They've found the perimeter. Scouts are approaching from the north and east. We must act quickly. Humans have survived by outthinking them, not outmuscling them. That is how we fight." Callan nodded, already calculating the steps they would take. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in open terrain for part of the defense, yet he felt no fear. Humans were not the strongest species, but their minds, unpredictability, and ability to adapt made them formidable. Lyra mirrored his calm, her eyes bright, ready for whatever was coming. The first patrol emerged over the northern ridge, tall, angular, their glowing eyes scanning the snow. The scouts had not noticed the hidden traps Callan and Raven had prepared. Snow drifts were rigged to collapse, rocks were positioned to slow movement, and the creatures Callan had raised were ready to distract and confuse the patrols. Humans had a way of using every resource at their disposal. and today they would demonstrate that clearly. Callan gave a subtle nod, and the first trap was triggered. A snow drift collapsed on the patrol, hiding their presence and forcing the others to hesitate. Lyra crouched behind a rock, watching, learning, and ready to move at the right moment. Humans did not fight with brute force alone. They created opportunities, exploited weaknesses, and remained patient until the perfect moment to act arrived. The aliens regrouped quickly, their eyes scanning the landscape for signs of life. Callan signaled, and the creatures moved from their hiding spots, darting between patrols, drawing attention and creating chaos. Lyra followed his lead, moving silently, positioning herself to assist if necessary. Every step, every movement was deliberate, part of a carefully orchestrated plan that relied on intelligence, cunning, and adaptability, traits humans had perfected over millennia. The patrols advanced, but the humans had already anticipated this. Hidden snares ensnared the aliens, legs, devices emitted false heat signatures, and traps funneled them into narrow paths where movement was restricted. The humans were few, but every one of them knew their role, and their unpredictability confounded the aliens. What they could not understand was that humans were patient, observant, and willing to endure discomfort and danger to achieve success. Callan moved closer to Lyra, whispering instructions. "We don't fight them head-on. We force them where we want them, where their numbers won't matter." She nodded, her small hands gripping a lever connected to one of the traps. With a quick motion, she triggered it, sending a cascade of snow and ice down a slope, sweeping a group of scouts into confusion. Their glowing eyes blinked in surprise. Even children could contribute, she realized, and even the smallest action could change the outcome. The battle continued for hours. Aliens moved with strength and precision, but humans had something they did not anticipate: flexibility. Callan and Raven coordinated movements, rerouting patrols, using the environment and improvising as the situation changed. Lyra helped, setting small traps, guiding creatures, and assisting wherever she could. Her presence was quiet but essential. Humans, even small and seemingly fragile, had an ability to influence events in ways stronger creatures could not predict. As the fight intensified, one of the patrol leaders advanced toward the sanctuary walls. It was the tallest, most imposing alien Callan had ever seen. Its eyes glowed fiercely, and its movements were deliberate and threatening. Humans would not match it in strength, but they had other advantages. Callan observed, calculating the risk. He signaled to a group of humans to redirect the alien leader toward a narrow gorge lined with traps. Lyra helped guide the path, her small body darting to pull levers and trigger diversions. The alien, despite its strength, moved predictably into the traps Callan had designed. Snow collapsed beneath it, ice blocks fell from above, and it found itself momentarily pinned, unable to use its power effectively. The humans did not strike directly. They moved with precision, disabling the aliens' mobility, exploiting weaknesses, and using the environment to their advantage. It was not brute force that won the fight. It was intelligence, patience, and creativity. The aliens struggled but could not overcome the combined tactics of the humans. Callan watched Lyra carefully. She was small, her face streaked with sweat and ice, yet she radiated determination. Even in the heart of danger, humans had a way of enduring, learning, and acting. She triggered one final lever, releasing a cascade of rocks and snow that pinned the alien, allowing the sanctuary's defenders to secure it. Even the strongest alien could not match the coordinated, clever movements of humans who understood their environment. The rest of the patrols, seeing their leader captured and confused by the terrain, began to retreat. The humans pursued only selectively, ensuring they remained safe while keeping the aliens off balance. By midday, the frozen plains were quiet once more. The patrols had withdrawn, baffled by the ingenuity of the humans they had underestimated. Callan, Lyra, and Raven surveyed the aftermath. The sanctuary had minor damages but remained intact. Humans were tired but victorious, not because of strength alone, but because they had adapted, improvised, and endured. Lyra, small and fragile, had played a critical role, proving that courage and intelligence often outweighed size and power. Raven approached Callan and Lyra. "You did well," he said. "All of you. Humans survive because they think, adapt, and endure. Strength alone is meaningless against that." Callan nodded, glancing at Lyra. "She's more capable than most adults would be in her position." Lyra blushed, but the spark in her eyes remained. She had seen firsthand how humans could survive against impossible odds. Even children, with guidance, courage, and determination, could contribute to the survival of their species. The sanctuary began to repair the minor damages. Humans worked together efficiently, sharing tasks, reinforcing defenses, and preparing for any future patrols. It was a community built not on sheer numbers or strength, but on cooperation, intelligence, and resilience. Humans had survived centuries because of these traits, and the sanctuary was a living proof of that legacy. As night fell, Callan stood at the perimeter watching the frozen plains. Lyra approached, her small hands brushing against his coat. "We survived," she whispered. "Yes," Callan replied, "but survival is only the beginning. Humans endure, adapt, and grow stronger with each challenge. This is who we are." Lyra nodded, understanding in her young heart what he meant. She had crossed frozen plains alone, evaded patrols, learned to move silently, and helped defend the sanctuary. She had seen firsthand the resilience, intelligence, and courage of her species. Humans were underestimated, hunted, and dismissed by many, but they endured because they never gave up, because they adapted, and because they used their minds as effectively as their bodies. The fires of the sanctuary burned warmly against the cold night. Humans moved about, tending to creatures, repairing structures, and sharing knowledge. Lyra sat by the fire with Callan, absorbing the warmth, the safety, and the lessons of survival. She realized that even though she was small and had faced dangers far beyond her years, she was part of something greater, a species that endured, a community that thrived, and a legacy of cleverness and courage. Callan watched her, feeling a quiet pride. She had reminded him why humans persisted. Strength alone did not define survival. It was determination, adaptability, and ingenuity that allowed humans to endure what others could not. Lyra had endured and contributed, proving that even the smallest humans could change the course of events. Outside, the frozen plains stretched endlessly, silent under the moonlight. The patrols had retreated, but they would return. Yet humans would be ready. They would survive again, using intelligence, courage, and cooperation to endure. Lyra, small and brave, had proven the truth of this, and Callan knew that humanity's spirit could never be extinguished. The night passed quietly, the sanctuary safe for now. Callan and Lyra stayed near the fire, speaking little, sharing warmth, and watching the creatures move silently in the shadows. Humans had survived another day, another challenge, and once more the galaxy would underestimate them. And that was why humans endured. Not because they were the strongest, but because they were clever, resilient, and brave. Even in the face of impossible odds, they adapted, outsmarted their enemies, and survived. Lyra had crossed the frozen plains alone and helped defend the sanctuary, proving that courage, intelligence, and determination were more powerful than any alien force. Callan looked at the stars above, their cold light reflecting off the ice, and felt a deep sense of hope. Humans had survived countless challenges, and they would continue to survive. Lyra rested beside him, small and fragile but filled with the spirit of her species. Together they had endured, and together they would face whatever came next.